Digital Series on Accountability to Affected Populations, better known as AAP, and Protection Against Sexual Exploitation and Abuse, better known as PSEA. And we're holding these sessions today and tomorrow to accommodate participants from different time zones. This is one of the webinars that CBi plans to conduct as part of our digital series, our online orientation sessions with private sector partners. We chose to start with these themes as part of CBi's commitment to the Interagency Standing Committee, or the IASC, for non-negotiables: protection, gender-based violence, accountability to affected populations, and protection against sexual exploitation and abuse, which is also a priority for the Secretary General, for the USG and our ERC. So accountability to affected populations and protection against sexual exploitation and abuse are of core importance in humanitarian operations. It's through these frameworks and approaches we ensure a positive impact of our operations. The private sector, of course, is a critical part of local communities, is in a key position to ensure proper accountability and protection of the communities in which they operate. At the same time, we understand that the private sector is a great source of good practices of community-led approaches and solutions, which can serve as inspiration to help improve the way we support affected populations. AAP ensures that the most effective people are placed at the core of all our humanitarian programming and activities, while PSEA enables the protection of communities affected by disaster or conflict from sexual exploitation and abuse. To support the private sector in AAP and PSEA, we have developed draft guidance notes on both. Now, I also wanted to, I know you can all see your screen, so I'm not going to read the objectives out to you in the interest of time, but we would like to hear your inputs on the draft guidance notes and your thoughts and comments on how best to move forward. So whilst you watch these two brief presentations, I would like to ask you to reflect what support you need from CBi for the private sector to actively engage in AAP and PSEA frameworks, as well as engaging in developing solutions. We'll discuss these ideas through Mentimeter activities and at the end of the webinar. So today's sessions will be facilitated by Riza Neri, our CBi Network Coordination Specialist, and Marie Contreau, CBi's Gender Specialist. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box, and we'll try to address them at the end of the presentation. And if there's any outstanding questions, we will also answer them and send out an email following the webinar. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand you over to Riza to discuss AAP.
Thanks a lot, Karen, and hello to our participants today. So my name is Riza, and I'll be facilitating this session on accountability to affected populations for the private sector. So the next slide will show how we will structure this discussion. As you can see, the overall structure of the session is in terms of answering the what, the why, and the how for accountability to affected populations for the private sector. So we will start with the basic definition of the concept and then move to understanding the need for it. While no one will argue against the need for accountability, the main question is, why is this relevant to the private sector? I clearly remember how when I was still with the private sector network, I would get slightly intimidated whenever we had activities with the UN humanitarian country team, admittedly. And we would have discussions on the protection principles, one of which is accountability. So the reason being is while I understand the need for accountability, but how can or will I relate this to how the private sector operates in the context of business continuation and emergency preparedness and response. So for the last part of the session, I'll walk you through CBi's suggested actions on how together we can come up with a shared understanding of accountability to affected populations and how we can promote this in humanitarian activities of the community, of the business community rather. So it's really all about also getting your feedback, your inputs via the Mentimeter activities on the suggested actions that we will present. So the Interagency Standing Committee, or the IASC, which is an interagency forum that brings both UN and non-UN organizations to strengthen and enhance humanitarian action, defines accountability to affected population as the active commitment of humanitarian organizations, or any organization at that matter, to use power responsibly by taking account of, giving account to, and being held to account by the people that these organizations are seeking to assist. So this definition prompts us to understand how private sector actors ensure that affected people have the power to co-design our humanitarian activities. Next, please. So understanding who are the affected people we commit to assist, or our organizations commit to assist, and by placing them at the center of our decision making allows us to adopt a people-centered approach in our emergency preparedness and response activities. So I know that there are tons of literature on participatory approaches, inclusion, and accountability. But the IASC's 3 dimensions of accountability allow for a very straightforward way for us to, first, take account of the diversity of the community and equally consider the views and opinions of women, girls, boys, and men from different age groups. Second, to give account to the people by providing them timely and accurate information in an effective and transparent way across communities. And lastly, being held to account, which allows affected people the opportunity to assess the quality of the response of our organizations and how relevant our activities have been, to assess how these activities have been implemented, and also to provide feedback on how well these activities have been addressing their needs. So this framing allows us to reflect how, when we use the terms community-based, as in community-based disaster risk management or community-based projects, we acknowledge that communities are not homogeneous entities, and that as private sector actors, we are able to respond to people's needs rather than solely focusing on what our organizations can deliver. So the next slide. All right. So now that hopefully we have a better understanding, or a basic understanding of accountability to affected populations. If we can go to the previous slide. Yeah. We go back to the question, why the need for this in how private sector actors engage in emergency preparedness and response or humanitarian activities. And I'm very happy with the with the participants we have today here. I see member companies, I see CBi member networks, and I see our partners, right? So how is this relevant to private sector? While there are different drivers and barriers to private sector engagement in humanitarian action, we do know that private sector has a critical role in making preparedness, response, and recovery activities more efficient and effective. And it has been proven, as evidenced by so many great examples of the CBi, some of the CBi member networks that we have in this webinar. And one thing's for sure, that we now operate in an increasingly complex environment that challenges the current ways we prepare for and respond to humanitarian crises. And these crises demand for fluid collaboration and a common sense of direction. So having the shared understanding of accountability means that private sector actors get to assess their response objectives and priorities vis-a-vis corporate business continuity objectives. I know, especially for business continuity professionals, this might seem a challenge, but it's possible. And this is an important discussion to have with your colleagues, with your fellow executives, or with the members of your network, because this will also help clarify your resources and capacities when you engage in humanitarian activities with the government and also with humanitarian agencies. All right, but now let's pause for a quick Mentimeter activity. So if we can go to the next slide. As part of this session exercise, yep, we'd be happy to hear from you, your inputs on this, right? So if we go to the Mentimeter, the previous slide, please. We will do a word cloud activity via Mentimeter. Yeah. So if we can go to the previous slide so that the participants can see. Yep. All right, so please grab your mobile devices, go to www.menti.com and key in the code 8843-2525. Yep. So maybe if we can present you, let's present the Mentimeter. Yes, and the key is 8843-2525. Nera, I can see the Mentimeter website, but maybe if we can present. Okay, so it's again, the Mentimeter code is 8843-2525. So go to menti.com and key in 8843-2525. All right, Nara, we can see if you can click on percent. There you go. All right, so we have the first presentation. So to answer the question, through this word cloud activity, who are the most affected people for your organization? Yep, I can see the answers on my screen. Yeah, but I see the answers. So people, thank you for those who have participated. I can see persons with disabilities, indigent, senior citizens. Good to see that we have women, urban poor, the LGBTQIA, disaster survivors. You know, it's important that we get to ask who are the most affected people for your organization, whether you're a local chamber, a private sector network, a corporate foundation, or even at the enterprise level, because this will clarify your response objectives and capacities, especially when you engage in humanitarian activities. I see MSMEs, very good. Returnees, youth, refugees, the elderly. I see women. There you go. Bigger word for women. Very good. Local, female, micro, business entrepreneurs or business owners. So that's a lot. IDPs. Great. So maybe we can have, and thank you for your participation. It's always good to have this kind of discussion within the organization, within the enterprise, within the chamber, within the network. Yep. Senior citizens, sexual gender minorities. We have children, SMEs, micro, small, medium enterprises, and persons with disabilities. Thank you. All right, so the Mentimeter activity, this will still remain open, and take a look, all right? Take a look at or remember your answers here as we go, as we proceed with the discussion in this session. So Nara, thanks a lot. Maybe we go back to the presentation. There you go. All right, and thank you for your inputs. Now, if we go to the next slide, how can the individual companies, corporate foundations, business chambers, and private sector networks practice accountability to affected populations? So we move to the how part. Yep, sorry, previous slide. We now move to the how part, or how can individual companies, if we go to the previous slide first, Nira, how can we practice accountability to affected populations, or how to operationalize this? Thank you. Yeah, correct. So the main messaging here is that now we understand what accountability to affected populations is, or at least have a basic understanding of the definition and the concept. Why it's important, why it's needed in even for the private sector. Now, how can this be practiced by private sector actors? So one would normally see this put into practice by humanitarian agencies through what they call the humanitarian program cycle. But here we classify the activities according to preparedness and response measures, which private sector actors can relate with more easily. So under preparedness measures, you can see that we have here similar activities that are practiced even in the private sector. So we have the usual risk assessment activity, preparedness actions, and contingency planning. And this is similar to how business continuity planning is done for enterprises. But for response measures, the activities relate more to when businesses engage in response activities such as rapid damage and needs assessment, or when you coordinate or conduct aid or relief distribution activities and other activities with the intention of assisting your employees, their families, the members of your network or chamber, and the bigger community where you operate in for humanitarian purposes. So these suggested actions are part of CBi's guidance note on accountability to affected populations, which we will share with CBi member networks for their feedback. And also, these suggested actions have been adapted from the ISC operational framework and the IASC suggested actions to strengthen accountability to affected populations and protection for intercluster coordination. Next slide, Nara. Now, on suggested actions on accountability to affected populations for emergency preparedness activities. First, let's click. First, on risk assessment. So when you do your risk assessment, expand the hazard and risk identification to consider how your employees and their families, your customers, or concession or business area will be affected when we talk about potential risks. So typically, these are or should be included in enterprise risk assessments for business continuity, so that you assess the risk and the vulnerabilities of the enterprise's critical activities and resources. So, and I do hope you conduct your risk assessment. And however, as you define the scope of your humanitarian engagement, which in a way can be considered or also considered as critical activities, consider expanding your risk assessment to include the risks and vulnerabilities of the bigger community in which the company, the chamber, or the network operates in. So use your answers during our Mentimeter activity a while ago to guide you with regard to defining who are the most affected people for your organization. Another practical way of introducing people-centered approach to risk assessments is the use of sex, age, and disability disaggregated data. So if you have your existing risk assessment or risk registers, start bit by bit. So with components that include assessing hazards and risks to people, start checking how if you factor in sex, age, and disability disaggregated data, how these data can help you deepen your existing risk assessments. And also for disability disaggregated data, see if you can reach out to other partner agencies like local government, non-government organizations, or civil society organizations who might already have this data and benchmark with them when it comes to reporting mechanisms and templates. Now, on preparedness, minimum preparedness actions, we focus on information provision, and here private sector can consider building a directory of community focal points and actively involving them in your exercises and scenario planning. So one of the professional practices and one of the beauty of business continuity really require external coordination with different agencies. But here, we explicitly promote the engagement of community partners. So if, for example, you are a water utility company that operates, let's say, reservoirs, Include local village partners when you exercise your flood early warning systems, yeah, for the facility, and make sure that they play an active role in enhancing the overall exercise program. Now, for corporate foundations, business chambers, or private sector networks, consider outlining in your crisis communication strategies how you will be able to provide timely and accurate information for affected people. So develop key messages and identify appropriate local means of communicating life-saving information. And on participatory approaches in contingency planning, we go back to the recommendation of building a common understanding of affected people in line with the mandate of your company or the corporate foundation, the local business chamber, or the private sector network. So this will really help in determining your response objectives and also clarify the scope of your humanitarian activities. So in business continuity language, this will help clarify your recovery time objectives, as well as identify the critical services that you would need to perform for customers and also for the bigger community which you operate in. And lastly, include external coordination with community focal points in your business continuity and crisis management plans. So consider making this explicit. Normally, this is, tucked into the strategies, but consider making this explicitly mentioned in your business continuity strategies and also crisis management structures. Next slide, please. So those are for preparedness activities. Now let's go to suggested actions on accountability to affected populations for emergency response activities. Again, in terms of context, the assumption here is that the company, your company, the corporate foundation, the business chamber, or your private sector network now engages in response activities. So it ranges from needs assessment and analysis, planning for response, to actual mobilization of resources and response monitoring. So the clustering you see here covers the wide range of response activities that private sector participates in. So both for business continuation and humanitarian purposes. So firstly, on a needs assessment. Needs assessment can sometimes be, it can sometimes be overwhelming. But this is an important first step in determining how your organization will respond to the needs of affected people. So consider coming up with a needs assessment questionnaire that includes questions to help identify information needs. What's the existing local capacity of the community, understanding what the community partners have been doing prior to the disaster event, and building on those local capacities. What are the protection concerns? So meaning ensuring that we get to provide them with their basic needs, but with respect to the dignity and well-being of those affected. What are their preferred solutions to their needs? What are the preferred ways to provide feedback and complaints, particularly when it comes to thinking about feedback and complaints mechanisms? So very specific ways that they can provide feedback and complaints with regard to the assistance. Also make sure to validate the results of the needs assessment through complaints and feedback mechanisms. Click on. Now, on response planning, this includes consider including as part of the corporate or the chamber or the network's crisis communication strategies, a communications plan for sharing information and disseminating messages on what has been delivered in terms of assistance and what are the next steps. So consider as well the accessibility of these communication channels. For example, if you do it via social media, consider not everyone has access to the internet. Yeah. So also include information on what has been done with their complaints and feedback that you have previously received. So the IASC Accountability and Inclusion Resources Portal, which will and the link will share with you at the end of the presentation. It's a good place to check on how other agencies are doing this, particularly good practices in complaints and feedback mechanisms. And lastly, on resource mobilization, where relevant and possible, consider forming a distribution committee and or a working group that includes local community representatives or your community focal points. And on response monitoring, make sure to invite local community representatives and focal points to take part in the monitoring process of the activities that you have conducted. So those are the suggested actions for both preparedness and response activities. But let's go to the next Mentimeter activity. Now, after hearing the suggestions or the suggested actions, we want to hear from you, right? Acknowledging that you already have good community-led solutions here. So grab your mobile devices, go to menti.com, and using the same code 88432525, share with us what are other suggested actions that you think can help promote accountability to affected populations that we should include in the guidance note or checklist that we have just shown. Yeah. So for those who have just joined us, the code for the Mentimeter is 88432525. What do you think? What are other suggested actions? What are good examples or practices that are already probably present in your organization? How can we improve the checklist? What else should we include in the suggested actions that we have just presented? A hotline for feedback from communities. Very clear. So a hotline, a dedicated communication line to gather feedback and complaints from communities. Another suggestion to include assurance of no retaliation. Okay, especially when community focal points are already providing complaints and feedback on the assistance that have been provided. Real-time, digital-enabled community feedback mechanism. This is real-time, and how do we do that, right? Please include conflict-affected contexts, marginalized groups, individuals due to religious, ethnic, or other affiliation, and ensure that analog feedback mechanisms are part as well, and consider illiteracy levels. Absolutely. Promote sexual abuse prevention, accurate and timely reporting, and regular sharing of best practices. Thank you. All right. So let's see, we have clear messaging to communities on activities and follow through on the given response actions and what else can be improved. Great. Now, again, because this online session is also a way for us to gather your inputs on the proposed suggested actions. We will keep these in mind as we finalize CBi's guidance note on accountability to affected populations for the private sector. Thank you very much. So we'll keep the Mentimeter activity open. We will consolidate your feedback. And for the last slide for my session, I leave you with the key resources on accountability to affected populations. So last year, we conducted the community engagement webinar. So some of these resources have been shared during that session, but here you can check out, we're sharing it again, and you can check out the ISC Accountability and Inclusion Resources Portal, which is a really, really good resource hub for everything all about accountability and inclusion. You can check out the menu of accountability to affected populations related questions for multi-sectoral needs assessment. So remember when we were talking about having the needs assessment questionnaire, you can check out the menu of or the list of questions that's already here for guidance. And another way for me to always keep on going back to to whenever I wanted to understand better accountability and inclusion, I watched the video, Ocho's video on the importance of community engagement during a crisis. It's very simple, very straightforward. See if you can share it with other member networks as well or partners. And then there's the link as well to the core humanitarian standards, which set out commitments for organizations and individuals involved in humanitarian response for them to improve the quality and effectiveness of the assistance that we provide. So that ends the session on accountability to affected populations. And thank you for your participation. I now hand you over to Maria, who will talk about protection against sexual exploitation and abuse.
Thank you, Risa. Hello, my name is Maria Contra. I'm a CBi gender specialist, and I will be facilitating the session on protection against sexual exploitation and abuse. So this methodology for the private sector is based on the Interagency Standing Committee methodology and adapted for the private sector. First of all, I would like to ask, please make sure that you are participating to the training in an environment where you feel comfortable discussing of the topic. And also, if you feel uncomfortable about discussing the topic, it is completely okay to only listen. For good environment also, please remain open and neutral to colleagues' comments and avoid any negative reactions or shocks towards anything that any participants might share. So, what is protection against sexual exploitation and abuse, PSEA? So PSEA supports the vision of humanitarian environment in which people caught up in crisis feel safe and respected, and in which all workers themselves feel supported, respected, and empowered to deliver such assistance in working environments free from sexual harassment. So PSEA is a responsibility of all actors and workers engaged in disaster management. And what is the role of the private sector in this? The private sector is in key position to ensure protection against sexual exploitation and abuse and protection of communities in which they operate, since they operate in most of communities. And we need to remember that sexual exploitation and abuse in humanitarian contexts constitutes acts of gross misconduct and are grave violations of rights of the people affected by crisis and of the responsibility to do no harm. It is also a serious reputational damage to the entity whose staff might be involved in such acts, including for its partners. And when we look overall, the Protect, Respect and Remedy framework, which states that the state duty to protect is to protect against human rights abuses, while the corporate responsibility is to respect these human rights. So PSEA also enables to meet the requirements of this framework. And PSEA is recommended to be meaningfully addressed at the decision-making level of each company as a cross-cutting issue in operations and to be brought to the attention of all staff. So I also wanted to mention the COVID-19 situation because it's a very specific situation when disruption to livelihoods, public services, and the freedom of movement can increase sexual exploitation and abuse risks for already vulnerable populations. The use of isolation measures further may limit access to information on protection measures and restrict access of victims to assistance and reporting channels. So it is not that the crisis would create new responsibilities, rather it highlights the importance of protection measures, and the COVID-19 should therefore strengthen the existing PSEA commitments. So we have a brief case study video, which we will now see next. While it is likely that the private sector member networks are not directly involved in the field level operations, but the staff of the private sector companies are. So I would like to ask you to reflect the video from the perspective of the overall operations and the humanitarian operations, as it is important to ensure that these messages to all staff involved in humanitarian operations, employees, subcontractors, and everyone involved. So let's watch the video.
This funny and handsome young man laughing with a group of friends is Abel, a relief distribution officer working for a local NGO. The NGO that Abel works for is a UN partner organization that recently opened a reception center next to Abel's village. Abel is known as a very caring young man, as he's always trying to give back to others what life has given to him. At work, he's very caring and professional with the beneficiaries. The young lady he's saying hello to is one of them. Her name is Frida. She's a 17-year-old girl living on her own near the reception center. Like everyone else here, she thinks Abel is really friendly. She's very shy, but eventually finds the courage to say hello to him for the first time. But probably not the last time. Despite this new friendship with Abel, Frida feels lonelier every day. She's completely dependent on humanitarian support and she hates her life here. Her closest friend, Lara, convinces her that the only way to have a better life would be to become Abel's special friend. As an NGO staff member, he could surely provide her with some extra resources and maybe even help her move to another country where she could start a new life. She could even go back to school and become a famous painter. Even though Frida doesn't feel comfortable with Lara's suggestion, she doesn't see any other way out. So one day, she decides to meet Abel at his house. She feels very nervous and confused. Abel is surprised to see her here, but decides to invite her in. After chatting for a bit, she finally tells Abel that if he provides her with some extra services and support, she would be willing to sleep with him. Abel doesn't know what to think. He would have never expected his friend to act this way. But Frida insists. She's a good-looking young girl. Maybe a bit too young. But in Abel's village, girls of her age would be married already. No, maybe he shouldn't. Abel vaguely remembers a training at work on preventing sexual exploitation and abuse. Unfortunately, he has forgotten the details since he did not think the training was important at the time. He believes that the rules probably don't apply to him anyway because he works for a local organization. And Frida is the one who showed interest in him first, after all. And they both really like each other. Why wouldn't he help her anyway? The next day, Abel tells his colleague Faustin what happened. Faustin doesn't feel comfortable with the story. He's not sure if Abel has acted inappropriately, It was a consensual encounter, he thinks. In the meantime, Abel and Afrida continue to meet in the evenings at Abel's house. Faustine soon learns that Afrida is only 17 years old. This is against the rules of their organization, which forbids sexual relations with anyone under 18 years old, no matter what the legal age of consent of the country is. Speaking with Lara, he also discovers that Afrida hopes to use this sexual relationship to gain access to more services or even move to another country. Faustine feels that Abel needs to put in these encounters. What if the community finds out?
We have some technical problems with the video, but let's see if we can continue in a few seconds. Okay, as the video was very much towards the end, there were just a few seconds remaining. I think we can continue. So let's proceed to the next slide. Just a moment. Okay, good. Now it's working again. So the video was already at the end of it. So we have 3 questions to start analyzing this case study, and we would like you to answer these questions. So here you have the first question: who is the victim in this story? So you can click on the option that you consider is correct. We have 4 votes. Let's continue a little bit more and see if more votes come in. We have 6 votes altogether. Okay, thank you for the votes. Can everyone see the results? Yes, I think everyone can see the results now. So most of the participants consider that Afrida is the victim here. Let's go to the next question. So who holds power over the victim? There are different power structures present in the society and in different situations. So in this particular situation, who do you consider to holding power over the victim? So here the options are Afrida, Abel, Lara, and Faustin. Let's just give a few more seconds before we see the results. Okay, now we could see the results on who holds power over the victim. So majority think that Abel, and also there is a vote for Faustin. And let's go to the third and final question. Is there any misconduct involved in the story? So you can say yes, no, it is complex, I am not sure. What do you think? Okay, I think almost everyone have voted already, so let's see the results. Yes, so most of the people think that there is misconduct involved in this story, and also that I am not sure. Okay, so let's continue, and we'll go to the next slide and start analyzing and demystifying the position and actions of each actor. So let's look at Afrida first. She is obviously in a position of limited power, and therefore she is the victim here. Abel is in a position of power. He has a status of a relief worker. He has power to say no. However, he has sex with a beneficiary and with a minor, and assumably providing more services in exchange for sex. Lara, the friend of Afrida, has peer influence here, as she pushes her friend to offer sex in exchange of additional services. And then Faustin is also in a position of power. He has a status of a relief worker and has the power and obligation to report misconduct. However, he wants to solve the issue alone. This connects us to the, if we go to the next slide, please. This connects us to the 6 core principles of protection against sexual exploitation and abuse. Let's briefly go through this. The first core principle is zero tolerance policy. The second one is no sex with children and 18 years, meaning. And the third one is exchange of money, employment, goods, or services for sex is prohibited. The fourth one is that any sexual relationship with beneficiaries that involves improper use of position is prohibited. The fifth one is all actors part in humanitarian operations need to report any concerns regarding sexual exploitation and abuse by fellow workers. And the sixth one is that the humanitarian actors, everyone who are considered as humanitarian actors, including the private sector, are encouraged to create and maintain an environment which prevents sexual exploitation and abuse. So these are the 6 core principles. When we go to the next slide, please. it is important to consider the victim's experience here. There is visible harm and there is invisible harm that can have long-lasting consequences to the person and to the community. And what would have been the proper actions in this situation? Let's go to the next slide to look more in detail. So what actions should have the characters taken? Abel first, the possible actions would have been to say no to Afrida. The impact of that would have been not committing to sexual exploitation and abuse. Lara, the possible actions should have been not to push her friend, and in case she is not sure, then ask for support or advice. The possible impact of that would have been Abel not having the opportunity to take advantage of Afrida. For Faustin, the possible actions should have been to report, and the possible impact of that, disciplinary measures for Abel. And continuing, the core importance is, if you see something, say something. A key to do this is also to partner with humanitarian actors at the country level and work with protection against sexual exploitation and abuse together. And the guidance tool that we have developed, the draft that we have developed, will provide more detailed guidance on how to identify suitable contacts for this. So going to the next slide, the role of the private sector is essential in finding solutions to this matter. And there are already existing practices in place in terms of protection measures. And we have also now developed the draft of the PSEA guidance note for the private sector, and would like to hear from you. Consult whether you consider it fit for purpose for the private sector. So I will briefly explain the content of the guidance note, which has these 6 core principles relating to sexual exploitation and abuse in the context in which private sector operates. Then it has a section of the COVID-19. It has a case example of what are good protection measures. It has resources. It provides contacts and resources at the national level. And further materials for training purposes, because it is important that all staff is knowledgeable of the protection measures, and also guidance on how to report sexual exploitation and abuse. These are the core areas which are included in the guidance notes. And now if we look at the key points to consider for the private sector in the next slide, please. So we wanted to include some key considerations that the private sector can take into account in their work with protection against sexual exploitation and abuse. So for the private sector, they can help to accelerate protection measures at the country level by improving accountability, ensuring safe and accessible reporting channels, and if needed, providing correct information to victims on assistance. So here are some actions to consider. It's a lot of text, but I will read through this, as then we would like to hear which you consider relevant, or whether you would think that something is missing and important to include. So first, to influence through company policy. So to consider protection against sexual exploitation and abuse as part of the company policy, the company codes of conduct, and in general conduct conditions, for example, to staff or subcontractors or suppliers. Then on education and reporting, consider to designate a protection focal point at your company and to establish a company reporting channel so that it would be possible to report also within the company system. Consider strengthening the information on PSEA for the company staff involved in disaster operations. More details about this in the guidance note. And consider strengthening the awareness of all staff members on their obligation to report. The fourth point is to consider strengthening the communication between the company and the external partners, such as the government, civil society, the UN, regarding commitments on the protection and PSEA. Also consider establishing or strengthening the internal sexual exploitation and abuse investigation procedures. So this on education and reporting. And then the third category, to lend unique business capacities to combat sexual exploitation and abuse. Businesses work in different areas, in different sectors. For example, in businesses working with communication, they are in unique position to help protection measures through communication, and in whichever sector the company is working with, they can always lend their unique capacities to help protection measures, to strengthen protection measures in disaster management, in humanitarian operations. And in addition to this, all actors to consider strengthening the availability of information on existing services to the victims. So these are the key points to consider for the private sector on how they can take the protection against sexual exploitation and abuse into account in their operations. And now we would like to hear from you. Obviously, the guidance note drafts will be shared with you for further review and discussion, as you probably want to consult with others as well. But we would like to hear your first opinions. The first question is, what is already in place at your company or at your private sector network or in your disaster management operations? We would very much like to hear your experiences, if anything of these key considerations is already in place. So let's give a few seconds time for responses. Any considerations? Are there any communication? Oh, now we start to receive answers. So PSEA is part of Code of Conduct. Very good. Training for staff. That's excellent. There's already training in place. Training and awareness among staff members. That's excellent. Grievance mechanism for sexual harassment in the workplace. Establishment of help desk. Excellent. referral pathways also established. AAP is a standard component for humanitarian disaster management, and some accountability to customer-facing engagement is part of our member corporates' work. Hotline, yes. Awareness and advocacy shared with the network. Excellent. We could go to the next question. So would you have any comments or improvements for the guidance note for it to be more useful for the private sector? So please do let us know. What do you consider useful? What do you consider not useful? Or if something was missing? So let's wait for a few seconds.
And we will share it after the webinar as well, if you can't remember exactly what was said. So we would, of course, welcome your comments after as well.
Definitely. Just to mention the key components of the points to consider for the private sector in protection against sexual exploitation and abuse. So the first category was to influence through company policy. The second one was on education, training, and reporting. And the third one to lend unique business capacities to enable protection against sexual exploitation and abuse in disaster management and humanitarian operations. So I see that we are receiving answer. Regular refreshing training, that is a very important point. It is important not only to conduct one training, but to always repeat the trainings so that all the new members are also trained, and to have a refreshing training. A sample checklist or charter, excellent. That is what we are aiming for with the key considerations, and hopefully we can elaborate a more advanced checklist in the upcoming products as well. A clear involvement of communities in the prevention of PSEA. Exactly, protection measures are very important, and that we have a clear involvement of communities with them. Add alternative reporting mechanism and consider that local small businesses does not have often effective PSEA mechanisms due to the capacity gaps. Yes, and hopefully the guidance note can also help on the information on that. More situation analysis and case studies, definitely. Simulation exercises, particularly on complex situations, that is definitely important. Okay, so now that we have received some excellent answers here, we will move to the next steps presented by Risa.
Sure. And thanks a lot, Maria. And thank you, everyone, for the active participation. Now, on to the next steps, right? I know that, I came from a private sector network, and I've worked with the corporate, in the corporate world as well. And sometimes it can be very, very overwhelming whenever you encounter these concepts, the principles as we speak a different language. But again, we go back to the messaging of the session that it's time that we explore a shared understanding of these concepts and principles. And that's why this offering, the CBi Digital Series, is our initial offering in exploring how we can help bridge that learning gap when it comes to the private sector and humanitarian agencies, particularly on accountability to affected populations and protection against sexual exploitation and abuse. And also, this is an opportunity for us to hear from you, because absolutely, there are already existing community-led solutions or approaches that are already being implemented or done by your corporation, by the enterprise, by the chamber, and by the private sector network. And thank you for sharing those with us during the Mentimeter activity. But as to immediate next steps, so us, the CBi Secretariat, will make ourselves available to support member networks in taking these themes forward within the network or with your member companies or even other private sector partners. So we kept on talking about the guidance note and the checklist. So we will share those with you. Those are documented guidance notes and checklists with the suggested actions. We will share it with the CBi member networks, and probably the networks can also share it with your member companies, because I see in the participants right now that there are participants who are members of our CBi member networks. So we'll share those after our session for your inputs, and we would welcome your feedback by Friday, April 23rd. So it's a way for us to also make sure that your voices are heard. So we will continue to consult with you as to what support you might need to convey this to your members and other private sector partners, and to build capacity and awareness, and to develop practical next steps. Yeah. All right. So, but we still have a couple of minutes, and maybe we can open the floor to if you have Q&A, if you have any questions, if you want to share what good examples or practices are already being done by your chamber, by your network, or any questions that you might want to raise. Feel free to unmute yourself if you want. Or you can also type in your question in the chat if you have any. Yeah. No takers. Yeah. I see familiar names in the call, but again, we do acknowledge that the networks already have really good practices and community-led solutions. So help us also understand how can we take this forward in ways that are practical and very relevant to you and also to your members. So last call, a lot to digest, but thank you for this. Someone messaged me directly. Oh, but thank you. Yeah, so feel free to get in touch with us. And yes, it can be a bit overwhelming, but the key here is let's start bit by bit. Yeah, so if there are no questions, okay, but wait, I can see some chat. Thank you, Hung, for very interesting session. Thank you for joining us. Nuri says that here in Ecuador, our UNDP country office, they developed a Spanish instrument named Gender Equality Seal for public and private companies. Now that's good. Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Great. Okay, so maybe I can hand this over to Karen.
Sure.
And for us to close the session formally. Thank you.
Yeah, first of all, I just really want to thank everyone for participating today. We know these are difficult subjects, but we had cases in Congo last week. This is something that, PSEA continues, unfortunately, to happen in disaster response. And so I really think there's and some of the participants online have played a critical role in developing solutions to try and address this in your communities. So it would be great. We're certainly going to share the draft guidance, but if you have any tools or things that you're willing to share, we can make them anonymous if you wish. With other participants in the call and other member networks, we'd really welcome your inputs. I think a lot of you have some concrete examples you could provide. So we also provided a lot of information. I mean, usually you would have individual sessions on both of these topics. It would be much longer. The humanitarian community has been doing, having discussions around this for over 10 years. So please reach out if you would like to have a bilateral discussion if something wasn't clear. We kind of view this as a first step about how we take this forward. So we welcome your really frank comments on the guidance and also your practical suggestions about how we take this forward. Would also be interesting to know how many of you are engaged with the humanitarian response frameworks in your individual countries. And if you're not, would it be helpful for us to help you introduce you to some of the key stakeholders there to take this work forward? So do let us know. We really appreciate that you've come and joined us today. We're going to end on time, actually a couple minutes early. But thank you all for your time. Thanks to Maria and Riza for facilitating. And we look forward to hearing from you and how we address this really critical, both two critical things, and also hearing your best practices. Thanks so much. Have a great evening, morning, wherever you may be. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you, bye.
Take care. Bye.